Welcome to another edition of Give Me an Answer. Thanks for joining. We've got a great one today with Dr. C. Stephen Evans. He is definitely mine and Cliffe's one of our favorite scholars on so many different issues, theologically, apologetically, and he really puts skeptics to task in a very kind, gentle, and yet piercingly straightforward way. And so, Stephen, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. All right. So he is the University Professor of Philosophy and Humanities at Baylor University. And Stephen, I'll turn it over to you to add a little bit to that.
Sure. I also have some other roles. At Baylor, I'm the director of the Baylor Center for Christian Philosophy, which is fairly new, and we're hoping to do some exciting things in the future. And I also, I'm a professorial fellow at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where they have what's called the Logos Institute for Analytical and Exegetical Theology. It's a fairly new program that brings together the insights of biblical scholars, like N.T. Wright was part of this at the beginning, theologians, and also Christian philosophers. So it's a lot of fun. I enjoy being over there too.
That's great. Okay, guys. So Stephen has written some great books. And one is, remind me one of your first ones that I have not read, but I know this is kind of a summary of it, which I've absolutely loved. So Why Christian Faith Still Makes Sense. You guys haven't seen this. And then your most recent on Kierkegaard. But was it Moral Obligations? What was that first one with the mountains on the cover?
I think you're thinking of my book, God and Moral Obligation. It's very far from my first. It's probably about my 15th.
Oh, gotcha. No, I know that one. I was thinking it has kind of the snow-capped mountains on the front.
Maybe it's Why Believe. Is that okay? What you're thinking of?
No, I know that one too. But all those are fantastic. So regardless, guys, check those out.
Natural Science and Knowledge of God.
Yes, that's exactly it.
You're quite right. Why Christian Faith Still Makes Sense is a book where I tried to take some of the complex philosophical arguments in Natural Science and Knowledge of God and express them in a more clear and simple fashion for what I would call ordinary intellectual readers. They're obviously not meant for everybody, but you don't have to be a professional philosopher or theologian, I think, to read the book and understand it.
For sure. Walk us first through, Stephen, a little bit of Kierkegaard, since I know that's freshest on your mind. How come you wrote a book, and I know you've written numerous actually on Kierkegaard. What about him exactly has really attracted you in terms of his faith, spirituality, how he lived, and why these books on him?
Well, I think Søren Kierkegaard was, of course, an early 19th century Danish thinker, and he was deeply Christian. And I think he is, in fact, the greatest Christian philosopher since the Middle Ages, that is, since the medieval period. He has an awful lot to offer. To the church, he offers a critique of what he called Christendom. And Christendom is the idea that, well, if you're born into a Christian family or in a Christian country, you must be a Christian. You're a nice person if you're not Jewish or so, that you're a Christian. And Kierkegaard insists that that's not the case, that real Christianity must always be embraced by the individual. You have to make it your own. It has to be a living faith. It's not enough to believe in God. You have to believe that God is your God. And you ought to make your life into something. He says that he tried to live his life in such a way as to show that God is real. And he thinks that's what all Christians should try and do. But Kierkegaard also has a lot to say to the secular world, to the secular philosophers. And one of the things that I think he says that's relevant is he thinks that our lives as moral and ethical beings already involves a kind of implicit awareness of God, because God is the Lord. He is the one who we're ultimately accountable to. And so even people who think of themselves as atheists, he thinks they have a kind of awareness of God. They just don't realize that it's God, because if they're aware of the moral law, if they're aware of their duties, then they're actually aware of God. He says in one place that there actually has never been an atheist in all of human history. Kind of an extreme statement.
I bet atheists love that one. Yeah.
Yeah, they really do. Yeah. But he has a serious point, which is, I think, that our moral knowledge does involve a kind of knowledge of some kind of transcendent standard that judges us. And we may not realize that that's God. We may think of it as just an abstract principle or something. That's how some atheists would think of it. But nevertheless, I think it's powerful stuff. Kierkegaard is the great philosopher of dealing with the fact that that our Christian life is not just intellectual beliefs. It's also a matter of forming Christian emotions. We need to learn to love and hope and fear all the right things. He talks a lot about what he calls subjectivity, and subjectivity are the sort of passions that ought to drive real Christian life. So I've been working on Kierkegaard for 50 years, and I found him to be a tremendous source of inspiration and enlightenment. I don't agree with him about everything. Those who have followed my career know that I reject some of the things he says. But I do think he was a deep Christian thinker, and that he has a lot to say to us. So my last book, I'll wave it up here. My last book is called Kierkegaard and Spirituality: Accountability as the Meaning of Human Existence. The whole idea is that to really understand what life is all about is to see yourself as accountable. And in the end, we're all accountable to God. It's a biblical theme. But and what I try and argue in the book, that contrary to a lot of what is called spirituality in our culture, there's a kind of cheap spirituality where spirituality is sort of like another something it's a consumer product. You go to the store and you buy what kind of spirituality you want, that fits you. But for Kierkegaard, we are spiritual beings, and spirituality is built into our nature. We're always going to worship something. If we don't worship the true God, we'll worship an idol. And so the question is not whether we are spiritual, but is our spirituality genuine or authentic? Is it counterfeit, or is it even demonic? I have a chapter in the book on demonic spirituality. So anyway.
Help us with that one a little bit. Demonic spirituality. Flesh that out a little bit for us.
Demonic spirituality, well, the model for demonic spirituality would be Satan. And Satan not only knows what's good and evil, but he has a clear understanding of good and evil, and yet he embraces the evil. And most of us are not really demonic. We're bad, we're evil, but usually we deceive ourselves, or we try to make ourselves believe that what we're doing is good. It takes a really kind of infernal kind of evil to clear-headedly do what's evil and embrace it as evil. That's what he calls demonic spirituality, and he thinks it's very rare. Most of us are not really up to to that. We're not up to rigorous faith, but we're not up to rigorous, you might say, anti-faith either.
Right. That's a good point. Is it so with Kierkegaard? Did he struggle with some anxiety and write against anxiety?
Well, he wrote a book on anxiety. He actually he wrote a book called The Concept of Anxiety, which is his attempt to explain what he calls the psychological preconditions for sin, and particularly original sin. And he thinks that in order for us to sin, we have to have some sort of knowledge of good and evil, and we have to have some kind of ambivalence built into our nature, such that we are in some ways attracted to the good, but in other ways we're attracted to the evil. And you might say, well, how did that come from? Didn't God create us good? And his answer is, well, God did create us good, but he created us with freedom. And when we have freedom, we have the awareness of possibilities, of different possibilities. But to be aware of alternative possibilities is simply to have the potential of anxiety, because that's what anxiety is. It's you're unsure. Do I want to do this, or I don't want to do that? I'm anxious. If I do this, what if? And if I do that, what if? And ultimately, if you ask what motivates sin, Kierkegaard thinks it's ultimately this, that our freedom, which is a gift that God has given us, that we should use to become God's friend, we misuse the gift by, he says, trying to, quote, lay hold of our own freedom. In other words, we try to make ourselves into our own God. We try to make ourselves the center of the world, the center of the self. So anxiety is a sort of precondition for that. It's not itself essentially bad or evil. It's part of our humanness, but it can become bad when we become sinful.
Mm.
And we, but we can also learn to be anxious in the right way about the right things. The Christian, you might say, learns to be anxious that he's not pleasing God, and that can be a healthy anxiety. Kierkegaard says in the book that he who learns to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate.
Mm. Wow, that's pretty powerful. Because I think of it, it's interesting too how Paul, obviously in Philippians 4, says, "Do not be anxious about anything," and then he gives us think on things that are right, true, noble, etc. But then we also read that he had anxiety for all of his churches, and so it's interesting to hear Kierkegaard kind of flesh that out in terms of there is a healthy type of anxiety.
That's right. I think, and clearly, I don't mean to say that there are pathological forms of anxiety. Obviously, there are forms of mental illness, obsessive compulsive disorder, where people have these sort of extremely unhealthy pathological forms of anxiety. And Kierkegaard isn't trying to talk about those, but he is saying that just to be a human being, we all experience anxiety because it's part of being free and having choices and having to take responsibility for our choices. So
Absolutely.
anyway, so yeah, that's one of his books. One of two. But he also wrote a great book on another profound emotion, the emotion of despair, and tries to trace all ultimately despair back to sin. Despair is ultimately a kind of failure to be the self God created us to be. So it's a kind of rebellion against God.
Mm.
But when we rebel in that way, instead of becoming somebody, we think we're becoming somebody by making ourselves the author of our own self. But actually, we lose the self. We become nothing. And despair is a kind of awareness of that emptiness, of that sort of nothingness that's there inside us.
Mm. That's great. That's a helpful intro to Kierkegaard there. Okay, shifting gears here some. Why have you focused so much on the moral argument and moral obligation? I think this could really help our audience. It could definitely help me more as well. This one it seems to me, academically and just in literature today, really, and also I think a lot of apologists debating with atheists, it seems like maybe the most prevalent one. Why moral obligation?
Well, I think it's not the only argument that I think in my book, Natural Science and Knowledge of God, I discuss design arguments and I discuss cosmological arguments, and I think there are lots of others. I actually have an essay in a really interesting book that came out a few years ago called 24 or so Arguments for God's Existence. And it was inspired by an article by Alvin Plantinga, who wrote an article called 24 or so Arguments. And in this book, what happens is each writer takes one of the arguments that Plantinga sketches and develops it. So anyway, that's so. I'm certainly not saying the moral argument is the only good argument.
So you
But
wrote that book. Did you say you wrote that book?
I wrote one of the essays in the book.
Okay.
There are
I was
20.
reading that book this morning, actually. So I'm going to
Yeah,
go check out your essay.
yeah. So my essay is I call it an argument from design for ordinary people. And what I try and do is to show, contrary to what some of the new atheists argue, that contemporary scientific accounts don't undermine at all, or even aren't even in conflict with the sort of natural sense that we have when we see the world, that it is purposive, that it shows evidence of design. The evidence is there, regardless of how it's explained scientifically. Science doesn't explain that away. It just gives an explanation, but that doesn't mean that what it's explaining is illusory or unreal.
And you're talking about some of that evidence being what specifically?
Well, I think we have a natural sense that many things in nature are not accidents. I mean, most people have a sense that their own existence is not an accident. That and that we look at. I mean, these are old things, but we look at nature and we see beautiful sunsets or beautiful mountains, and we say that's beautiful, and somehow we think there's something deep and profound there. It's not just an accident that the world contains these features. Or we look at ourselves, we look at the human body, we look at how marvelously and fearfully we are made, how incredibly intricate the eye is, or how the heart works, or the lungs pump air in and out of the body. And we naturally say, this thing looks like it's designed to do something. It has ends and goals, and it works pretty well. Science can maybe give explanations of how that came about, but the fact that something that seems to be designed, that we can give an explanation of the design, doesn't show that the design is not real. That's the basic point made in the article. And I think myself, and this gets to a central idea of my Why Christian Faith Still Makes Sense book, I think that many of the what we call the arguments for God's existence are simply attempts to focus on and articulate and clarify what I call natural signs, which are simply things that God put into the creation, which naturally suggest that he is there and he's real. And he also gave us a natural inclination to sort of be able to read those signs. I think even people who are unbelievers sometimes, most of the time, in fact, if they haven't worked hard at it, they feel the force of these natural signs. So I think they provide powerful evidence. And I think that the signs can point people in the direction of faith in God or belief, even without any explicit arguments, although sometimes arguments can be helpful in helping us understand the sign and why it works as it does and why it points as it does.
So you're sitting at, say, a dinner party, it's a holiday party in a few weeks from now, and there's a really nasty new atheist who pulls up a chair right next to you. And he starts attacking Christian faith. He's making a lot of bold assertions, not just bold, but bald assertions too. And where do you go first? And I've noticed in some of your writings, you're not just kind of brain in a vat. You do a great job kind of addressing the whole human being, emotions, or psyche, as well as obviously the intellectual side of faith. But where do you start typically if someone like that sits next to you?
There's something, if I'm actually having a conversation with a real person, I'll try and assess the situation and find out what's really on this person's mind. Are they really interested in believing in God? Do they really care? Do they recognize that it would be good if there were a God? Or are they just playing a kind of intellectual game and they want somebody to joust with? And I will deal with those two situations differently depending on my assessment of what's really going on. Sometimes jousting with someone just doesn't do much good. It just sort of confirms their stance. But I think that if you look at the published writings of new atheists, there are often several misconceptions. And if you can eliminate those misconceptions, then you can proceed to have a profitable discussion. One of the misconceptions is this. The new atheist tends to think, and you get this all the time, that believing in God is something like believing in ghosts or believing in the Loch Ness monster or believing in Santa Claus. That's one I get all the time. If you believe in God, you believe in Santa Claus. I once was teaching a Sunday school class of 8th graders, and the pastor's son hit me with that.
TKs, they're rebellious.
So they think, look, if I believed in the Loch Ness monster, you would say, where's your evidence? And you would say, the burden of proof is on you, because you and I, we maybe agree about their lions and tigers and bears and dogs and cats and trees. And so we're all agreed about that. But then I add this one thing, the Loch Ness monster, and you say, the burden of proof is on you if you want to add one more thing to your metaphysics, to your ontology. And I would agree with that about the Loch Ness monster. But God is not one more thing in that way. So the new atheist has a sort of misconception of the status of God. To believe in God is not to believe that there's one more thing in the world, another finite thing on a par with other finite things. Rather, to believe in God is to believe that the world as a whole, the universe as a whole, has a different character than it would have if there were no God. God is not one more thing in the world. He's not on a par with things on the world. That's a completely misguided. Almost all theologians have grasped this and understood this. And so if I believe in God and the person I'm talking to doesn't, we don't just disagree about God, we disagree about everything. Because I think that trees only exist because they have the character of being continuously sustained by God, while he has the view that trees are just collections of atoms and they just exist because they exist, and there's no reason why they exist. There's no ultimate explanation why they exist. So we don't just disagree about God, we disagree about everything. Now, I grant that he has a right to say, well, why do you believe what you believe? But I also think that the materialist or the naturalist who rejects God, I have a right to ask this person, why do you believe what you believe? And there are problems with your worldview too. And so once we understand that, we'll see that there's no special burden of proof on the theist. That what we have here are what we might call rival metaphysical views. There's materialism, there's theism, there's idealism or spiritualism. There's pantheism. There are all these different worldviews. And so we should examine them all and see what their strengths and weaknesses are. And I think that changes the game quite a bit. And in fact, it changes how one might think of these arguments, because in many ways, the arguments for God can be viewed as arguments against naturalism or materialism. They are sometimes, I say in the book, they're arguments for what I call anti-naturalism. So even if they don't always get us all the way to believing in the biblical God, they open our eyes to see that there may be more things in heaven on earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio, as Shakespeare said. They might make us more open-minded, less dogmatic. One of my problems with New Atheism is that they're dogmatists. They accuse religious believers of being dogmatists, but they're actually not very interested in listening or looking at the evidence or the arguments in any kind of fair way. That's pretty clear.
Interesting you just went there, because I was debating an atheist not too long ago who said, I absolutely have no beliefs. And we had been debating another atheist who was a little bit more humble over in the UK, who frankly said, look, I have all kinds of beliefs. So I hear you use that word belief there, and how materialists especially have beliefs. What do you mean by that? And why do they push back so hard? Well, we know why they push back so hard, actually, but how would you convince them, perhaps, of that?
Well, there's different, of course, theories of belief available in philosophy. I actually have a kind of a heterodox view of what a belief is. A lot of philosophers follow John Locke, who's, of course, a famous early modern philosopher. Even a lot of Christian philosophers follow John Locke. And Locke thought that a belief was something like this. He called it assent to the truth of a proposition based on the probability of the proposition on a certain body of evidence. So what I do is I look at the evidence for a proposition, and the evidence doesn't make me certain of the proposition, but it does mean that I think the proposition is probable. And so Locke says, I believe it, but my belief, he says, should be proportioned to the evidence, and it should rise and fall depending on whether there's a lot of evidence. So a contemporary Christian philosopher like Richard Swinburne follows Locke at this point. So Swinburne is what we call in philosophy a Bayesian. That is, he believes that a lot of our beliefs should be proportioned to probability, and we assess probability based on what's called Bayes' theorem, which is a theorem in the probability calculus. And you can say, well, I think this is 0.62 probable, or 0.78 probable, or 0.85 probable, or something like that. So that's one view of belief. My view of belief is actually more like Kierkegaard's, and also John Henry Newman, the famous British philosopher, theologian, who became a convert to Catholicism late in his life. He'd been an Anglican earlier. But Newman wrote a book called The Grammar of Ascent. And he says, Locke's view can't be right, because the belief that some proposition P is true is not the same as the belief that P has some degree of probability. I might believe P is true and not even know what its probability is. So Newman says they've got to be different. So what is belief, or assent in his language? And I think basically it's something binary. It's like this. You tell me. Suppose you say, do you believe in say infant baptism? And the answer will be yes or no. I'm either for it or against it. Do you believe in say balanced budgets? And the answer is yes or no. I believe we ought to have balanced budgets, or I believe we don't need to have balanced budgets. So belief is something like being for something or being against it. And if I'm willing to say I'm for it, then I believe it. Now, of course, belief can come in different forms. You can be for something just a little bit, kind of tentative or weak in your support, or you can be really strong, and so on. So there's different kinds of belief. But I think basically belief does have a kind of binary character. It isn't just a matter of proportion, and it often doesn't have much to do with probability, because we often don't know how probable a belief is. We often aren't able to even, Newman makes this point in his book, often many of the things we believe, and we have evidence for them, but it's evidence we've acquired over our whole lifetime. It's not like we can bring that evidence to mind suddenly at a moment and assess it using Bayes' theorem. There are a lot of things like that where our evidence, in a way, we have too much evidence, and we've had it for so long that we can't bring it to mind in consciousness and assess it easily or clearly. So a lot of our beliefs are like that. Mm-hmm. But I think if Swinburne and Locke were right, then it would be impossible for someone to decide to believe in Christ. But of course, Billy Graham showed that many people did do that over a long, long time. So I think that belief can be something like a decision. Obviously, I don't mean to say that I can just decide to believe things that I know aren't true. That's not possible. If you offered me $1,000 to believe that Abraham Lincoln never existed, I couldn't do that. I might pretend that I could, but I couldn't actually do it. So we don't have voluntary control of our beliefs in the sense that we can just make ourselves believe anything or everything. Mm-hmm. But there are things that we're tempted to believe, that we feel we're drawn to, and I think we have the power to say, I'm going to be committed to that. And maybe I'll look for evidence, or maybe I'll look at the evidence I have in a new way, or maybe I'll act as if I now start acting as if I believe this, and pretty soon I'll find myself believing it. Psychologists have shown that our beliefs tend to fit our actions, that when we act as if something is true, we find ourselves believing it is true. So I think that's something that we're hardwired to do, and I think that's one. I think C.S. Lewis somewhere says that becoming a Christian can be like that. It can be like, it's like putting on a costume. We take on a role and we start playing it, and we find that more and more the role is us that we decide to play.
Interesting. What about, okay, so back to natural science, because I know you are quite well known for these. On page 31 of your book, another example of original natural science would include facial expressions. I thought this one was fascinating. It appears that even infants naturally respond to smiles with smiles of their own and perceive angry facial expressions as threatening.
Yeah. Well, this is derived from in early modern philosophy, there was a great debate over how do we gain knowledge of other people's minds, and how do we gain knowledge of the external world. And many people wanted to give a kind of causal theory. And they said, well, I have these sensations that are occurring in my mind, and I think, well, there must be something out there causing these sensations. And they posited there must be an external world, or there must be other people. But there are real weaknesses in this sort of argument. And a philosopher named Berkeley exploited those to defend idealism or spiritualism. Berkeley said, there's really nothing but minds. To be is to be perceived. And he says, how can you know that there's a physical thing out there causing your sensations Because to know that there's a physical thing causing your sensations, you'd have to have direct access to the physical thing. But if you only have access to your sensations, then you wouldn't know that. It's sort of the old saw of if a tree fell in the forest and no one's there to hear it, would it really make a sound? Berkeley's the one who first sort of invented that. Well, a philosopher named Thomas Reid responded to Berkeley and to Locke and Hume and said, these people have got it wrong. It isn't that we start with these internal sensations and then infer that there's an external world. Rather, our belief in the external world and our belief that other people exist and they have minds, the basic beliefs are grounded in what Reid called natural signs. They're not inferences. We don't reason our way to believing in the external world. It's not like I look out, I'm looking at a window right now, you can't see it, but I see a tree, and I might say, oh, well, it appears to me I'm having the sensations I would have if there's a tree out there. Therefore, I believe there's a tree out there. No, I don't develop a belief in the tree on the basis of any kind of inference or argument. I just look out there and I see it. So Reid says what happens is you have these sensations, that's true, and they're internal. But you have been made in such a way that when you have these sensations where it appears that there's a tree out there, you just believe there's a tree out there. The sensations are natural signs. And in the same way, facial expressions are natural signs. When someone frowns, it's a natural sign that they're unhappy. When they laugh, it's a natural sign that they're enjoying themselves, that they're having fun, right? So I took that idea from Reid and said that maybe our knowledge of God could be analogous to that. Just as if there are natural signs that provide a basis for our knowledge of the external world and our knowledge of other people, maybe God has implanted in his creation natural signs, clues, you might say, which point us towards God. And so it is a kind of evidence, but or it can be treated as evidence, but it can also be treated the way John Calvin thought. John Calvin thought we don't need to prove or give arguments for God. Calvin said we have a kind of natural, what he calls the sensus divinitatis, a natural sense for God. And if we weren't sinful and fallen, we would all just naturally and spontaneously believe in God. But we don't because of our fallenness. So I think that Calvin is right, that sometimes people don't need arguments. They just believe in God naturally because the sensus divinitatis is triggered by the natural signs that God has put into the world. But I also think that we can give arguments. But what we do when we give these arguments is that we focus on the natural signs and we articulate why they point as they do. And that can be helpful to some people. So there's a debate, sort of an argument going on within Christian philosophy between what is called evidentialism, which says we got to have arguments, and people who follow the more view of Calvin, people like Alvin Plantinga, who say they're called reformed epistemologists. My view is we don't have to choose between these two. I think they're both right. We don't always need arguments, but it doesn't mean that we can't give arguments and that arguments aren't helpful and valuable.
Doesn't Plantinga give a lot of arguments, though?
Yeah, he does. He agrees. Yeah. I mean, we're both in agreement without this. He doesn't argue that you can't give arguments or that they can't ever be helpful. He just argues that you don't need them. And he also argues, and I think he's right about this, that arguments don't have to be proofs. There's been a lot a lot of atheists say, well, you can't prove it, and if you can't prove it, I don't have to believe it. But really, there's almost nothing in philosophy that can be proven.
Right.
We give evidence, and what an argument does is it shows you what the cost of rejecting the conclusion of the argument is. If it's a good argument, it says, okay, you don't have to believe this conclusion, but here's the price you're going to pay. You're going to have to deny this premise. And I think that that's the way we should think about arguments. I don't think God wanted to give us proofs, because I think in the end, God wants us to love him and serve him freely. Mm-hmm. But if it were totally obvious to us that God existed and God were omnipotent and omniscient, well, we couldn't help but say, well, it would just be stupid not to serve God. So I think God allows I think he only gives us signs which are there, and for people who want to see, they point in the right direction. One clue for this I got from Pascal. Pascal says something like this is also true of the New Testament, that when you look at John, the Gospel of John, John says Jesus gives us signs. He doesn't call them proofs.
Yeah.
He doesn't even call them miracles, although we often talk about the argument from miracles. But John says they're signs that Jesus provided to enable people to see who he is. And the interesting thing is, there were people who saw the signs but didn't believe. People who saw Jesus perform miracles. So I think we should have the right sort of view of the purpose of arguments, and not claim too much for them, because in a way we are giving too much credit to the unbeliever. Kierkegaard says we shouldn't always assume that someone who says, "Well, I'm not going to believe because you haven't given me enough evidence." It might very well be that if we gave them tons of evidence, they still wouldn't believe, right?
Right.
So we shouldn't assume that the problem is always evidence, or even ever evidence.
Okay, on that one right there, Stephen, that one's really helpful because I was going there. Let me know if you're getting a feedback loop. I'm getting a pretty bad one right now. Let me try and sit back. But
I'm not getting any. No.
So when it comes to evidence, though, I'm finding the following as really hot right now with some of these new atheists that we've been debating, and these guys know their stuff. I think they do fall into, like you said, the kind of the more fundamentalist camp, but they'll say that's not evidence. That's not evidence. And even if you go with, you're so good at the moral argument, maybe if you could answer two questions. One, why do they say that, and what is evidence? So you kind of nicely broke down faith for us and what faith is. Now, help us with what exactly is evidence, and then why is the moral argument, because I would consider the moral argument as tremendous evidence for the existence of God. And then, so here comes a third piece. When atheists say you need some type of supernatural or some type of, typically it's something around, they'll kind of change their wording, but you need this extraordinary type of evidence for an extraordinary claim. So help us with evidence, help us to have a response there to the new atheists, or any atheist for that matter, and then maybe lead us into the moral argument, because I personally believe that's so profound, and I've really benefited from your writings on the moral argument.
Well, the question of what is evidence, of course, philosophers disagree about what is evidence, just like they disagree about almost everything. So there's some people who want to limit evidence to propositional evidence. So propositional evidence would be a proposition that makes some other proposition more probable, or perhaps even makes it certain, and that would be a deductive argument than a deductive sort of proof. But I think in ordinary life, most people don't agree with the philosophers who limit evidence to propositional evidence. I mean, detectives will say, "Oh, the fingerprints on the gun, that's evidence," but fingerprints are not propositions. We might, if I came home at night and found my front door open, and everything, and things were taken out of drawers and strewn around the room, I would take that as evidence my house had been burglarized, right? So there, in general, I mean, the general account I would give, the most broad account, is evidence is whatever moves us towards truth. It pushes us in the direction of truth. Sometimes evidence is experiential, sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's propositional. And of course, we don't always agree on what is evidence and how weighty evidence is, because we don't agree on what the truth is. So that's a problem. But in general, I think that whatever account you're going to give of evidence, in the end, you're going to have to accept something like the following principle. If something seems to be in such and such a way, that is evidence that it is that way. if I see my house and it looks as if it had been burglarized, that's evidence that it was burglarized. And of course, we know things are not always as they seem, and we can have evidence for claims that, in fact, are not true. We can have misleading evidence or evidence that it might even be really good evidence, but sometimes even really good evidence can mislead us because we're finite, fallible beings. We're not omniscient like God. We're not perfect. So that's what I would have to say in general terms about evidence. And that's why I think natural signs do count as evidence. And as far as I can tell, even if I were an atheist, I think I could admit that there are certain things in our experience that seem to push us towards God, that seem to count as evidence. But if I were an atheist, I would just think it's not enough evidence, or they have more evidence on the other side, or I think actually my atheist friends who are philosophers, I think most of them do take that stance. That is, they don't say that there's no evidence for God, but they think that there is stronger evidence on the other side, say the problem of evil, or some other kind of counter evidence. That's what I guess. Now you asked me several different things. I think you wanted me to get around to the moral argument.
No, yeah, you answered those first two, and then we'll go moral. But let me just add one quick question back to that great point that you made, because I loved how you broke down different types of evidence. But so what is your response to an atheist who really tries to stick it to you on just there is no evidence for the Christian God? I mean, how do you start to kind of work around that?
Well, the first thing I think I'd have to do is to say, well, what would count as evidence for you?
Yeah.
And if he says, well, if God wrote in the sky, I'm God and I exist,
Right.
I would say, well, I think it's misleading. Why do you think you have the right to demand that kind of evidence? I think the reasonable thing to do is to say, if there were a God, for a moment, let's not say one way or the other. Maybe there's a God, maybe there's not. But if there were a God, what kind of evidence do we think God would provide for his reality? And that's what I try and talk about in my book. I try to say that the kinds of things that I call natural signs is precisely what we would expect. In fact, I even cite atheists who agree with me about that, who say the same sort of thing. So I think that's important. Why
is that in this one? That's in this one, right? Some of those atheists.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, great.
It is.
That's
although I think there's a more expanded version of it in Natural Signs and Knowledge, where I have extended discussions of Kant and Hume and other non-believing philosophers, and even some contemporary non-believers.
Stephen, those atheists who will say to you, okay, I'll grant that natural signs are actual evidence, what are they saying specifically in terms of the agreement? And do they go on from there and say that there's other forms of evidence that they will consider evidence?
Well, I think what they would say is that they would admit that there are things that, taken by themselves in isolation, seem to point towards belief in God. After all, they might say, belief in God or gods has been practically universal in every human culture that we know about. So there must be something natural that sort of pushes us in that direction. So even people like David Hume admit that, I think. And even some of the new atheists do. I mean, was it which one said that it was he thought that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, implying that until Darwin, atheism didn't really have a good case. But since now, I think he's quite mistaken, as far as I can tell.
Right.
One can accept evolutionary theory, as say Francis Collins does, and still believe the world is designed, and that the evidence of design is something God put in there in the world, so that we would see His handiwork. So anyway, that's the way I look at it.
Okay, so just closing remarks here and question. Moral argument. Is this kind of your go-to? Just close us here, because I want our audience to really walk away with, I think the natural science has been really helpful, because we really haven't touched on that in our channel. And that's not one where me and Cliff typically go with when we debate on college campuses, whether it's philosophers or students. Help us to walk away now, though, with the moral argument where we could really have it down in a simplistic yet complex way, if that's possible.
Sure.
And
Well, you can boil the argument down to in very simple terms, and it goes like this. You say, first premise, there are objective moral obligations. We're objectively obligated to do certain things. And my version of the moral argument starts with obligations. It doesn't start with good or value, and that's a very important distinction. So for me, an obligation is something like a duty. It's a law, something that I must do. It isn't just something good to do, something I have a good reason to do. So the first premise is there are moral obligations. The second premise is if there are moral obligations, there must be something that obligates us. There's got to be a ground of the obligation, and God is the only reasonable ground. Now, the reason why I think this argument is effective is that you can find atheists who agree with both premises. It's just not the same atheist. There are quite a number of atheists who would agree that if there were objective moral obligations, God would be the only explanation. And so they wind up denying objective moral obligations. So philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche or J.L. Mackie, they basically concede that the second premise is true. If you have moral obligations, you got reason to believe in God. And then there are also lots of atheists who accept the first premise. That is, they believe there really are objective moral obligations, because I think we have a moral sense that God has put into us. So it's possible to defend this argument and have atheist allies for both of the two crucial premises. Now, to be sure, there are, of course, believers who reject the argument, who think that we can explain morality without God. But I think they're mistaken. What usually happens is they've confused an obligation with simply this. They think I have an obligation is an act that I have good reason to do. So as soon as I have goodness in the world and I accept the principle that I ought to seek what's good and avoid what's bad, we have reasons to do things. And they're right about that. We do have reasons to do things. So even in the Garden of Eden, prior to God giving Adam and Eve any commands, he just put them in the garden, and there's a good garden, and there's good things to do. They have reasons to seek the good things and eat from the good fruits and enjoy the garden, right? So that's perfectly right. But I think they don't really have, in the strong sense, duties or obligations, because we only have an obligation when you have, in a sense, something that obligates you. And I think the best account we have of an obligation goes like this. An obligation is always relational. When I have an obligation to obey the law, the legal human law, why? Well, it's because I'm a citizen of a state, and there's a state that has authority to issue laws, and those laws obligate me. If I'm obligated to give money to a church, why? Because I've joined the church and made a pledge. And so the church can hold me to the obligation. Or why do I have obligations to a friend? Because I've made promises to the friend. Obligations are always relational, and they're always to persons. So there's always someone who can sort of hold me to that obligation. But moral obligations are universal. I think some of them are absolute. They hold universally and unconditionally. And I don't think we can understand them or explain them as grounded in any human relationships. And so the only plausible candidate is that they're grounded in God, who is the sovereign, not just of my country, but of the universe, the one who made it. That's a quick and sort of simplified and dirty version of it, but I expand on that. I do think it's very important to recognize that, in my view, ethics has three sort of dimensions or areas. We need a theory of the good, an account of what's valuable. We need a theory of virtues and vices. What are the qualities, the traits, the excellences that we human beings should seek to have. But we also should have a theory of duty, a theory of obligation. And I think it's the duty part, the obligation part, that most powerfully points to God. I think the others, indirectly, you can develop a kind of moral argument from the good, but it's a much more hard thing to do. I think it's what you have to do is to say, well, how is it that the universe itself can have value qualities? After all, a lot of philosophers like Hume think, look, facts are facts, and nothing has value intrinsically. Things only have value because we like them or dislike them. So they want to say that value always comes from us. It's all purely subjective.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that's true. And I think at some deep level, we realize that that the value of a beautiful sunset is not just in us; it's in the sunset. And so I think we can say that ultimately, why should the universe has value? Because it's made by God, and God is the good. I'm a kind of Christian Platonist. There are different ways of doing moral arguments. And you probably know that William Lane Craig is famous for his debates, and he develops a moral argument. But my argument's quite different from Craig, because Craig doesn't like Plato or Platonism. But I'm with St. Augustine and C.S. Lewis and Kierkegaard, all of whom were Christian Platonists. So on my view, we can make sense of universals like goodness by seeing them as a part of God. The problem with Plato is that he just thinks that there are all these universal possibilities, goodness, but he doesn't really know how they exist. But if we say that they exist as part of God, then we have a basis for, and then we can say, why does the world have value? Because it was made by a God who is good, and he made the world good. And he says in Genesis, he makes these things, and he says he saw that they were good. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say that he decided they were good. He saw they were good. His creation is good because he made it good. So I think you can argue for God from the good also, but I think it's much easier to recognize God as the lawgiver, mm-hmm. Who holds us accountable. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a kind of instinctive, intuitive, this is why I think C.S. Lewis showed such wisdom in Mere Christianity when he begins the book with a moral argument.
I wonder, on a pretty regular basis, I'll get an atheist saying, well, I do believe in moral objectivity. What's the big deal? And then I'll also get an atheist say, I just believe in the good. That's why I'm moral.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's kind of getting what you're talking about, because he does talk about Plato as well. And this was a professor down here in New Jersey that we recently debated. How do you think those two?
Ultimately, I think that's a, because I don't think we can prove to them that there's a God, but I think we can ask, which makes more sense? Platonism in a world that's just came out of the Big Bang for no reason, or Platonism in a world which is the creation of a good God? And I think basically they're just pounding their fist at this point, or stamping their feet and saying, I believe in the good, and it's just a brute fact. There's just the good, and there's no way of explaining it. But I would say, well, how do you relate that to the other things you believe? Do you think the world is made of atoms and so on? Isn't it kind of weird that the two basic constituents in your universe are something spiritual, like the good, and something purely physical? It seems really odd. And how do you bring those two together? Well, the theist can make sense of the fact, because God decided to make matter, and God is good. And so matter can take on these characteristics.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of ridiculous, too, to think that this type of morality came from, whether it's the evolutionary perspective, social perspective, the powerful, obviously just the personal, individual subjectivity. All of these you can pretty much wipe out rather quickly.
What you ultimately have to do, and what I do in my version of the moral argument, is you have to show how God explains morality, and then you have to take on one by one all the alternative secular explanations, like, say, a social contract theory.
Oh, yeah.
Or subjectivism. It comes out of our emotions or something. You just have to show that those don't work, and that's the job that I take on. And I think it can be done. So It's
Great.
it's not. But I don't. Ultimately, I don't claim that I can give a proof that will convince any reasonable person, because people are reasonable, but they're still people.
Right, right.
And their reasoning is shaped by what they hope and fear and love. And
Yeah.
in a sense, one thing that I would like to always ask someone is, would you be glad if there were a God? Do you want God to exist? Because if you don't, the first thing I have to do is to help you see that it would be good for God to exist. If you don't want God to exist, you probably aren't going to be argued into it. As I think as a proverb, a man convinced against his will holdeth the same opinion still. And, and years ago, Simon and Garfunkel said, "Still a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest."
Right, exactly.
You can look at politics and verify that observation.
Right, right.
I won't get into politics, but
I thought you were going there. I got really excited here for a second. Well, we will let you go here, Stephen.
yeah,
And just final question here before we let you go to
yeah.
dinner there in Waco, Texas. Why? So you would start with that question, which I love. That's a great one. Then might you go to the natural signs, then the moral argument? Is that kind of a progression? I know there's probably no perfect formula, but leave us on kind of what is your personal formula?
Well, another argument that I would use, and it's the Kierkegaardian argument, and it's also an argument Lewis gives, would be the argument from desire. I would say the fact that ultimately there is something in us that needs God, wants God, that demands that there be a God, is in fact evidence for God. And far from being worried about the wish fulfillment argument, I think that a lot of atheism is actually grounded in wish fulfillment. People are afraid that there might be a God,
Right.
or they don't want there to be a God. They want God not to exist, and so they disregard the evidence or they don't look for it. So I think ultimately this is why Kierkegaard is so helpful. We have to get back to the heart. We have to get back to the emotions. It isn't as if we are purely sort of thinking machines.
Right.
We are we're bodily human beings, and our thinking is the thinking of real people.
It's beautifully put. It's so true. It has to be lived out. It can't just stay in our heads like brains in a vat.
Okay, well, Stuart, thanks. It's been fun talking with you, and I've enjoyed it. Hope you have too.
Certainly have. So is our audience. So appreciate you, Stephen. Why Christian Faith Still Makes Sense, as well as his most recent on Kierkegaard. Check it out, guys. They will be tremendously helpful. And when talking to Christians as well as non-Christians. Stephen, take care. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.